right, today we will be talking about hurricanes. All right, so first we have the how and the why of hurricanes. So to start out, a general definition of a hurricane is a localized low pressure weather system. And so hurricanes typically, they'll have organized thunderstorms, but there's no actual front that separates the masses of air. And then another defining feature of hurricanes is that they have very high wind speeds, and that has to occur at least 74 miles per hour. And so hurricanes will typically start out as a tropical wave, and this will create a low pressure area. And then when the hurricane moves through the tropical areas, those have a lot of moisture. So then it just adds to the force of the hurricane and eventually becomes a super powerful storm. All right, next we have the threat of a hurricane. So, as we probably know, hurricanes pose a great threat to life and property. So, the things that occur mainly with hurricanes are a large amount of storm surge flooding, and that's when there's an abnormal rise of water. And so, we can see from this picture that that causes a lot of damage, especially to properties. And this is also the leading cause of hurricane-related deaths in the United States. So this is one of the main threats from hurricanes. So the flooding can travel several miles inland, and then it also can go along bays and rivers and just cause a lot of damage. The next part is the wind and tornadoes. And so a lot of the wind can destroy buildings and homes as well. And then the tornadoes can continue to come inland further. And the ripped currents are also a part of hurricane threat. So that will carry a lot of debris back into the water and just cause a lot of damage to properties as well. So there's been some recent hurricanes, and this is just some of the damage. So Hurricane Ida had 150 mile per hour winds, which led to obviously power lines being down, which led to the main 8 major transmission lines in New Orleans that deliver power were all lost. It is believed that they had not built a resilient enough system since rebuilding after Hurricane Laura in 2020. Larry Gastiger, who is an executive director at WIRES, which is a proactive planning investment in North America's infrastructure, believes that there might not be wires that can withstand hurricanes due to their severe conditions because of just how recently updated the power lines were in New Orleans. Another damage that is common is collapsed homes, and this is a picture from Hurricane Ian. Hurricane Ian hit Florida's eastern coast, and there were up to 81 mile per hour wind gusts. And we can kind of see in this picture here that this right here used to be a seawall, and seawalls were created by community members to help prevent their homes from collapsing. But every time there's a storm, it gets washed away. So when Ian hit, it was already too diminished, so it did nothing. So the seawalls erode away, and it didn't do anything. So we can kind of see from these two graphs that when the risk is greatest in both the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific basins. So for the Atlantic, we have a graph that shows hurricane and tropical storm activity from 1944 to 2020. We're going to focus more on the yellow, which is hurricane activity. The Atlantic hurricane season is June 1st through November 30th, and the Atlantic basin is the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, and the Gulf of Mexico. Historically, the most activity happens between late August and early October, that you can tell in there, with kind of mid-September being the peak. And then the Pacific Basin's hurricane season is a little more spread out, as we can tell on the graph. We don't have this one big peak. So their hurricane season runs from May 15th to November 30th, and the Eastern Pacific Basin extends to Mexico and Central America. Perfect. So next is the risks in 3 different locations. So our county from the West Coast that we looked at was San Diego. And so this actually has a very low risk of 25.3. And the overall natural hazard risk for this area is super high. It's at 99.68.
And those are from other natural hazards such as drought, earthquakes, heat wave, and you can see the whole list there. So there's a lot of factors that cause that to be a very high risk area, but one of the main factors is not hurricanes. And then in the Midwest, we looked at Marion County, which is in Iowa, central Iowa, and that actually as well has a very low risk, even lower, of 3.9. This makes sense because hurricanes cannot go that far inland, so there is little to no risk of having a hurricane in Iowa. The overall risk of that area as well is also pretty low at 43, but those are more from like winter storms, strong wind, tornado hazards, and such. And then on the East Coast, this has a very high risk. So we looked at Charleston County in South Carolina, and it has a very high hurricane risk of 99.6. And then it also has an overall natural hazard, pretty high risk of 99.46. And so that is a combination of hurricanes, heat waves. They also have things like lightning and wildfires that add to that overall risk. And then as you can see on this map, the areas of red have a higher hurricane risk. And so that occurs on the East Coast, the southern coast, in the Gulf of Mexico. And then it just starts to diminish as we get further and further inland.
So hurricanes have very strong effects, but there are some ways to mitigate them. So first, there was an article from a Naples news article that was released actually just yesterday, about a year after the hurricane, that residents should expect tougher building codes because of how hard that hurricane last year hit, and this is expected to be put in place just to help mitigate the effects. A specific example that I read about was that Naples residents could see a change of using wood frames to now using concrete blocks, even for homes that aren't beachfront, just because the concrete blocks are going to be much harder for winds or waves to break than the wood blocks. Here are 3 other examples of how to mitigate effects of a hurricane. So first would be to build the seawalls. We kind of touched on those earlier, but those can help prevent waves from coming up onto the homes. And then another popular way to mitigate is to clear the lawn completely from before the hurricane hits, so that no debris is flying, because debris could hit people, other objects, so that can make a mess. And then lastly, hurricane grade shutters can be very helpful so the windows don't shatter. Windows that shatter can be a huge danger because of the shards of glass, pieces of glass that can be washed up, which can hurt people even more if they can't see because of the water, the flooding, whatever that may be. Hurricanes bring a lot of damage that obviously cannot be avoided due to the high winds, but these little steps to prepare can really help cut down on damage quite a bit.